Hello, everyone, and welcome to this Global Engagement Online Series, or GEOS, a program of the United Nations Association of the USA. My name is Farah Eck, and I'm Senior Director of UNA USA. Today, I will be assisting with the administration of today's exciting event, which is being recorded. You will soon hear from our guest speakers, after which time there will be time for questions and answers. If you have a question at any time, please type it into the Q&A box, which can be found at the bottom of your screen within the navigation bar. Selected questions will be read aloud as time permits. Please note that the chat box will not be monitored, but you can access a link for speakers' bios within the chat box in just a moment. And now, without further ado, I would like to introduce my colleague, Catherine Cross, Executive Director of Communications at the Better World Campaign, which is a sister campaign to UNA USA at the United Nations Foundation. Catherine?
And welcome, everyone. We're excited to have you here, not only because of our esteemed guests, but also because this conversation is so timely. As many of you know, the UN Security Council is currently debating the renewal of critical cross-border routes used to deliver essential humanitarian supplies into Syria. This comes in the midst of the coronavirus pandemic and shortly after the imposition of new US sanctions. So there's plenty to talk about. You will have seen the bios of our guests. We'll have them again in the chat portion of your screen, as Farah mentioned. So in the interest of time, I won't repeat them here other than to note that our first guest, Kevin Kennedy, is the Regional Humanitarian Coordinator of OCHA, which is the UN's Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs. Sanjana Quazi is the Deputy Head of Office for OCHA, and Husni Al-Barazi is the founder of Big Heart, an NGO that operates in Syria. So Kevin, let's start with you. It's been 9 years of civil war in Syria. Where are we in the conflict? What's the situation now? Kevin, I think you're on mute. Kevin, you're on mute still?
Can you hear me?
Now. Okay.
Now we've got you.
Yeah. All right. Thank you very much. Well, thank you for all joining us on this call on a very important topic. And first of all, also thank you for the work of UNA, USA, and the advocacy you do on behalf of the United Nations in the United States. It's very important. I've had the opportunity to work with UNA USA in different fora, and their work is really deeply appreciated. So I'll be brief in my comments, and we could talk for hours about Syria, but highlight where we're at. As you say, Catherine, it's a 9-year war, and the war continues as we speak today. There has been enormous human suffering, enormous loss of human life, a massive refugee outflow, some 5.5 million people in the neighboring countries, another million in Europe and elsewhere. A massive displacement within the country. Over 6 million people have moved, many of them 3, 4, and 5 times to have the fighting. The education of children has been disrupted, with hundreds of thousands out of school. Women have suffered, particularly in this conflict, from gender-based violence, and all the burdens have been put upon them. And of course, massive human rights violations, which again continue to this day. On top of this, we're now dealing with the COVID-19 pandemic, which is, I think, further added to the work that the UN, and I should say the NGOs, have to do. We're really fortunate to have today on this call, not only Sanjana, who is my deputy in Amman, but also Mr. Husni Al-Barazi, the founder of Big Heart, a Syrian NGO, has worked on the ground in all the difficult spots, has lost a number of its staff killed along the way too. So there we are. And Catherine, if you would permit, let me turn to Sanjana for a couple comments on Syria and Husni, and then we'll be glad to take on any questions that the guests might have. Sanjana, over to you.
Thanks, Kevin. I hope you can all hear me. I'm actually going to focus more on the needs in 2020 and beyond. As per the opening by Kevin, you know, the Syrian crisis in its 10th year, which is approaching the length of the combination of World Wars I and II. A generation of children has known nothing but hardship, destruction, and deprivation. And as you know, hundreds of thousands of people have been killed, Syria remains a humanitarian catastrophe. The UN and its partners estimate that up to 11.1 million people were in need of humanitarian assistance at the beginning of 2020. Of these, 4.7 are in acute need. However, the economy has deteriorated significantly throughout 2019 and in early 2020. And of course, COVID-19 related mitigation measures have only worsened the situation. So more people have lost their jobs as a result, particularly those relying on daily wage labor or seasonal work, and access to basic services was curtailed for a significant amount of time during the period of lockdown between March until May, pushing more people into food insecurity, further reducing their ability to cover basic needs such as shelter, water, education, nutrition, and health. Humanitarian partners are currently running a number of needs assessments to evaluate the people in need, but we assume that the number of people may have increased since our initial estimation earlier in the year. In real terms, the average cost of basic food items has never been higher. To put things into perspective, the cost of bread and rice is now 6 times what they were at the height of the crisis in 2016, which was just a few years ago, and 16 times higher than in 2011. According to WFP World Food Program, almost half the population, some of 9.3 million Syrians, are now estimated to be food insecure, an increase of 1.4 million in just the last 6 months. Not only that, but the number of people severely food insecure, that is those going to bed hungry, has almost doubled from around 570,000 to over 1 million. So from an economic standpoint, at least, things have never been worse. So generally, needs are most acute in the following settings. Densely populated areas, which you see a lot in the Northwest, where the ratio of IDPs and returnees to host communities tends to be very high, and where access to key services such as health and WASH, but also income opportunities often severely curtailed. This includes 9 million people, including most districts in Northwest Syria, Damascus, and rural Damascus. Of particular concern are the 1.4 million IDPs living internally displaced people living in so-called last resort sites. These are like collective shelters, self-settled campsites, unfinished buildings. The vast majority of these particularly vulnerable displaced populations are concentrated in the Northwest, as I said. Other areas that we're also concerned about are those where critical services is significantly curtailed, including large parts in Northeast and also Southern Syria. In all these geographic areas, women, children, and other vulnerable groups, such as persons with disabilities and the elderly, are disproportionately affected and at risk. However, some of the response achievements I would like to also say upfront, given the dire situation, that in 2020, January, 6.7 million people were reached from all response modalities. When we say this, we mean, you know, through inside Syria, cross line, cross border from Turkey and from Iraq, compared to a 5.6 million reached in 2019. So it's an increase of almost 20%. Inside from Damascus and cross line, food assistance for more than 3.2 million people, nutrition support for 500,000 children, critical water and sanitation for 1.3 million people, and 4 million medical procedures have been conducted. In addition, the cross-border operation from the Northwest Syria coming from Turkey is delivering lifeline for 2.8 million people in need. However, at the end of the day, we need to, of course, support lives, but what's also important is the sustainability and coping mechanisms for lives and to live in dignity and participate in their communities. A few things that we are calling for are that schools are needed to give 2.5 million children an education that's been lost, and generation that's been lost. Hospitals and clinics are needed so women can give birth safely and seek help if there are complications. And last but not least, families should not need to spend 1/3 of their salaries on water, nor have to face the impossible choice of spending the little money they have on basic needs. So let me stop there on sort of where the acute needs are for the Syria crisis. Over to you, Catherine.
Oh, okay. Thank you, Sanjana. Husni, your group is on the ground, there.
Yeah.
I'd be eager to hear what this looks like on the ground, for you. So first, if you can tell us a little bit about your group and what it was intended to do, what need it was filling, and then tell us how things appear on the ground to you right now.
Thank you, Catherine. I think the prior two speakers gave you a lot of data, a lot of figures, but I can think behind every of those numbers is a story and a life, a human being. And what's sad about Syria, as been stated earlier, is not only we're entering the almost 10th year, it's 10th year of awful living standards inside Syria. Going into Big Heart very quickly, it's an organization that I founded with a few very strategic people. I come from the private sector, and I am to be a Syrian American. My concerns were there were gaps into the intervention. The UN body was not on the ground, and we decided to go to the border and assist. And most of the NGOs at that time that were deployed at the Turkish border, we operated in northwest Syria at that time, were very much occupied, overwhelmed of managing the camps. So Big Heart decided to go deep inside Syria, 200-300 miles in, and we actually intervened into first food security. We found a number of people that had very much dire needs for food. We then added to it the NFI shelter, and we grew into the education and wash and sanitation. Our strategic initiative, and we are an NGO and we are a nonprofit, was for a development purposes. And there was a gap into the emergency response, which is what you call Syria today. It's still an emergency response. After 10 years, it's still referred to be as an emergency response. So with emergency response, you have to have a different modality where you move a lot. And what we did is I brought the private sector experience into supply chain management. We built an infrastructure inside in an area that is almost about 100 miles from north to west, and east to west is about 250. And we took care of almost 2.5 million people. In that modality, we ended up working in a very difficult situations, unprecedented. As you look at the numbers that were shared with us, it is the most dangerous area to work in. It is so dangerous that very few international actors are on the ground. So humbly, the face of the response and the humanitarian response is done by Syrians like myself and our staff. I have not spent the first 5 years of the conflict, almost 50% of my time inside Syria. I've survived a lot of crazy stuff, but the epicenter is our interest to serve the most vulnerable. In that came in partnership with the UN, partnership with the NGOs, where we have built our own capacity and we grew it into collaboration to eliminate any type of duplication and coordination. The Syrian story is very complex now because it is actually part of a geopolitics. I think very few Syrians could tell you what's going to happen to Syria. But on the humanitarian space, we have made progress. We were one of the few agencies that were in charge and helped feed about almost 175,000 people in East Aleppo until that area was actually taken over by other groups. We learned a lot about the modality and the impact. We learned about our data and the most vulnerable. We evacuated, and unfortunately, we lost 15 staff members of Big Heart. The total staff of Big Heart at one point was about 450, and we're now down to 250. But it's not about Big Heart. It's about actually the other Syrian actors that we collaborate with and the other international actors. But what we do make a difference on is we are the face of the intervention, and we have taken probably the most risks. And in some cases, probably some of the risk was shifted to us. But we did it honorably, we did it with dignity, and we did it for the best benefit of the individuals. Concerns about Syria today is really, as my colleagues has indicated, 10 years where you have 10 years of lost generation on education. We tried our best to put forward and improve, rehab some schools, but you really can't say enough about barrel bombs coming down, indiscriminate attacks, and infighting on the ground. That is the area that we operate. For that, we're not remote management, which is one of the concerns of a lot of the donors in the world. We are hands-on. Our staff do cross back and forth, and it has given us what I would call great learnings. What we can do better is, reach more people, and that requires more resources. So it's not a plea from this forum that we need more money. I think all agencies need resources. What we can learn about those resources is they're getting thinner, and because of a lot of governments right now that are internally focused with COVID and their tax revenues are not there, I, as a Syrian American, concerned how much of those commitments that have been pledged are going to be delivered for the next 6, 12 to 18 months, because it is a period that you really, if you want to double down on Syria's humanitarian cause, this is the time to do it. And it's never enough resources, but we are in a space of about 4 million people, and those individuals are living pretty much in hell conditions. I'll stop right there. I know there are a number of questions. I didn't want to get into the data as much of my colleagues have said, but I'll summarize with 2 numbers for you. Syria is 22 million. Technically, for all practical purposes, by various study groups, at least half of Syria has been either displaced or have become a refugee. At least 500,000 people have died. And the most concerning is you have about a third of the population being out of school now for a minimum of 10 years. These are alarming numbers. Being an economist and looking at what's happening to the region and what's happening to the currency devaluation, the last thing I close with is an average family in Syria used to live on about $75 a month. Those numbers are not there anymore because they actually barely have $22 to $23 because the cost of food have went up 3 times. We have part of it and other agencies that do, but with the vulnerability increasing, it is really very much in a failed state. Thank you very much for the opportunity, and I look forward to an open dialogue.
Thank you, Husni. You mentioned geopolitics and the humanitarian response, which both of those things are colliding right now in the UN Security Council. So I wanted to turn to Kevin to ask us, to tell us rather, a little bit about what's happening, what's at stake now as the UN Security Council takes up the discussion of critical cross-border routes, humanitarian routes into Syria.
No, thanks, Catherine. And I mean, just a general comment. I've been involved in a number of emergencies over the years, and this is the most politicized of operations crisis I've worked in. Everything we do or we don't do is criticized by one side or another or multiple sides, and political meaning is attached to pretty much all the humanitarian operations. In the current discussion to renew the cross-border resolution, and just to go back for maybe listeners who aren't totally familiar with this, in 2014, the Security Council, because aid was not reaching large parts of Syria and due to be stopped by the government of Syria, basically, they authorized a cross-border access from neighboring countries. 2 openings from Turkey, 1 from Jordan, and 1 from Iraq. In subsequent years, particularly as of early this year in January, the crossing from Iraq, Al-Urubi, was cut off. Jordan was cut off the previous year and didn't make a difference then because the government had taken over that area. But 2 remained in Turkey, where the largest group of people who in need are located. In the current discussion, the Russian Federation has said only 1 opening from Turkey should be there, and only for 6 months. Where this is to happen, it's going to make our life much more difficult, and most importantly, make it much more difficult to meet the needs that we have in front of us. One crossing, without getting too technical, Bab al-Hawa, serves the Idlib government in the main. Bab al-Salam, which is further to the north and east, serves area occupied by Turkish military and other armed groups. Were we to lose that crossing and still try to service that area, it would first put our workers at greater risk because you have to go through different conflict lines, checkpoints, etc. It would increase the time to get there from like 20 minutes to 2 or 3 hours. It would add a lot more expense. And our crossings, particularly the big one, Bab al-Hawa, is operating at capacity right now. We often work 7 days a week, run up to 120 trucks a day, and there's a very detailed protocol to inspect the trucks to make sure everything is correct and there's no contraband. So it would really impose, in an already challenging environment, it would impose additional problems that we really don't need. I think if anybody's interested in meeting basic humanitarian needs, we need all the crossings we can get. Back to you.
Thank you, Kevin. I guess I wonder, given the intense geopolitics at the moment, I wonder, is there a backup plan? If the worst happens, and we pray that it doesn't, what do humanitarians do? Well,
there's been a lot of planning in the event that there was no resolution or a partial resolution. I won't go into those details. We will work to make things happen, as I think we always say, we collectively, UN and NGOs, international, national NGOs, but it would certainly make our task a lot more difficult. And of course, the fear is that people will not receive the support that they need. The area serviced by the Bab al-Salam crossing goes into where some of those dense campsites are at. In Northwest Syria, there's about 1,000, actually 990 separate camps where displaced people have congregated. In the best of circumstances, and we've been to these camps, they're pretty meager. And in many cases, they're not good at all. I mean, sanitation, shelter, things are just abysmal, particularly all the people who were driven there in the last 6 months during the fighting. So if we had, it's hard enough now trying to maintain even a basic standard of support. To lose the crossing that allows us easy access to these camps, it's clear it would be much more difficult. You're on mute.
Yep, we all do it at least once. I'd like to turn to Sanjana now, just to talk a little bit about the pandemic and how that's affecting relief efforts. I mean, I know that Physicians for Human Rights has verified that I think it's 595 attacks on medical facilities over these past nearly a decade. And my question, Sanjana, is how, as you're facing down a pandemic, how does that impact the ability to respond?
Thanks, Catherine. I mean, I think I mentioned some of the compounded sort of impact of COVID on already a terrible situation. So, but I'll speak a little bit more about it, and also maybe speak about some of the things that we have been able to also do in response to COVID. Of course, the destructions of healthcare facilities raises an IHL concern, which is international humanitarian law, and has had a crippling effect on an already struggling healthcare system, and further limits the humanitarian space available for us to provide services. The added layer of complexity that COVID-19 has brought into the already difficult operating environment, as I said, it has deprived people of their jobs and livelihoods, and compounded an already grim socioeconomic outlook that I mentioned and Husni also spoke about as well. While to date, the number of confirmed COVID-19 cases in Syria is relatively low. I mean, I think the last count is about 312 people affected, and about 10 deaths here and there. But there's still high levels of internal displacement, densely populated areas, acute levels of pre-existing vulnerability, and as we said, a fragile health system, poor water sanitation to add on to it, and a huge informal labor market all mean that Syria remains an extremely high risk country to COVID. The relatively low number of tests conducted, there are around 9,000, may also account for the low number of confirmed cases. So we're only going by reported number of cases when we say about 312. So what we're seeing, in other words, could be very well just the tip of the iceberg. So there's more, there might be more, there might be another wave, there's all of that, that's all the uncertainties remain. Surveillance and testing capacity remain our key bottlenecks in the response. The daily testing capacity has risen to 345 with significant variations across the country, especially very low in the Northeast, but still falls short of the target of 2,000 tests a day. As I said, to date, we've just been able to do over 9,000 tests in 6 laboratories and 1 testing site. Within Syria, many humanitarians have reported that the volatility of the informal exchange rate, as also mentioned before, has led to temporary suspension of local procurement, including vital COVID-19 related materials, affecting, of course, program delivery. In the Northeast and Northwest, these challenges are coupled with restrictions and disruptions of imports that are vital to the response. Few of the needed COVID-19 community-based treatment centers are operational, also due to the lack of healthcare workers after years of crisis. Partners have integrated risk mitigation measures and communication into their activities, enabling distributions and services to resume after an initial slowdown in March and April. By the end of April, 4 million people were reached with expanded water services, of course critical for hand washing and other preventive measures. Education and protection related activities at community level and for specific vulnerable groups have been also impacted by mitigation measures. There are awareness raising activities that are being conducted, including television, radio campaigns for partners from within Syria, and have reached more than 12 million people. So let me leave it at that on that question.
Husni, I just want to follow up with that. Thank you, Sanjana. How has it changed, you know, the life, or has it changed the life of your colleagues on the ground in Syria?
Lives of our colleagues in Syria?
No, this was for Husni. I was asking how how it's impacted, how the pandemic, coronavirus has impacted folks on the ground in Husni's group.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, the first thing we did, like everybody else, when we learned is we had to put an emergency response task force inside Syria with its limited resources. As you led into the question, you know, the medical facilities, which we have partners and cooperations with other health actors. My own organization does not cover health, but the first thing we did is we tried our hardest to see where the gaps are in those hospitals. And what we found out very quickly is the gaps are large. PPEs were not, available. So we actually helped bring some of those forward from Turkey with approvals. That took a little time. For our luck, for so far, we have not had any major cases or what I would call a overrun. Some of the testing has taken place, but on a daily lives, the danger we face right now is we cover areas that have high density of camps. So really social distancing is impossible. You can try your best by creating a social awareness program, which we've done door to door, tent to tent. But when you have a family of 5 or 6 in a very much a 25 square meters, and with sanitation not being as accessible, having a water run once a week, it almost puts you at an exposure. So these are the things that are creating big fears for us. For the time being, they're manageable, but God forbid something does overrun like what we're seeing in other countries in the world or South America. that it is going to take us to an nth degree of what we've done as an organization is we have enough of our own PPEs in place for our distributions, but that just protects our staff, but that does not actually protect the most vulnerable in the beneficiaries. We have done the social distancing in the distributions. But in Syria today, in the northwest and the northeast, I think we have been lucky to, at least if the numbers are not fully reported, they're still marginal. But God forbid something happens, it's going to take us to another. I mean, if you can think of a perfect storm where the country has been ravished by civil war for 10 years, 50% of the infrastructure has gone away. World Bank said we would need between $400 to $500 billion to rebuild Syria. And then you add to it what I would call the status quo of geopolitics and overlay COVID and the economy coming down. We are in very big trouble with that. So I do believe the U.S. aid group have tried to push forward some equipment, PPEs, through the various humanitarian medical actors, and that's well received. But whatever that is, with WHO, it's probably not enough. As you know, that's the same story you hear in the medical across most of the countries in the world. So we are exposed, but we're not as exposed as other places as the overrun of the infection.
Thanks, Husni. Yeah, it does make me think of the pledging conference that recently concluded, and I was interested, Kevin, in your opinion. A lot was raised, 5.5 billion, but the goal was 10 billion. So that's quite a difference. Speak to us, if you could, about the needs there. Are you going to be able to do what you need to do with the 5.5 billion that's been pledged?
No, thanks, Catherine. It's a good question. One of the small positive elements of the crisis over the last 9 years has been the consistent generosity of donors. And always the phrase donor fatigue. And we've all been involved in crisis where there's great interest for a year or 2 years, 3 years, but then the interest wanes off and contributions decline. This has not been the case in Syria. And Syria is consistently, of all the appeals worldwide for crisis, is the best funded appeal in the world. Yes, we do not receive all that we'd like to receive, but we do receive in the range of about 2/3 of it, which is substantially higher than most of the appeals in the world. There are things that donors do not respond to, longer term projects, projects perhaps that may be seen to be more supporting the government. I mean, I'm using their words, not mine. But the basic needs, the food, sanitation, they're generally met. There's a gap, and our boss, Mr. Mark Lowcock, the head of OCHA, made clear last week in a big conference we had in Brussels, is education. And education is often not seen as an emergency kind of thing. It's something that should be done a bit later. But as Husni pointed out, you have these literally millions of kids who have no education, are very fragmented education, school in Syria, a couple places, school in Turkey, school in Jordan. I mean, it's not the way to educate somebody. And he's really appealed this year to put money behind education and to help there. And that would be a huge difference. Back to you.
Thank you, Kevin. We are about at the time where we're going to open it up for questions. And so I'm going to hand it off to my colleague, Farah, who will pose some questions to you. And I also, even if the question is directed at one of you or another, I would encourage, others to kind of jump in if you've got a point of view on that question as well. Farah?
Great, thanks, Catherine. And so we do have a question for Sanjana from Aisha. In Syria, with COVID-19 in mind, what are the 2 clusters that OSHA should focus on mostly in the next 12 months?
I assume that if you're saying that by clusters, you mean sectors, absolutely health and WASH would be the top. But I mean, of course, with that, I mean, it's hard to, it's really hard to talk about just health and WASH because, as you know, COVID is not just a health crisis. It has, for us, it's all of our interventions are seen from sort of a multi-sectoral lens, which means that, you know, you don't just do health or WASH. I mean, you need to take care of the other repercussions, such as, you know, nutrition, and you've heard the food security numbers are really high. The ability and to procure has been impacted. So it's sort of multi-layer. But if I had to just choose two, and when it comes to COVID, I think the top ones are going to be health and WASH.
Thank you, Sanjana. We do have a question for Husni from Jennifer Gilliard. What do you think needs to happen when war continues, but we still need hospitals and schools built for safe deliveries and education? How can we rebuild if the war has not stopped?
Yeah. Great question, Jennifer. Thank you for the question. It's the epicenter of humanity and humanitarian mandate. The simple answer is we do not see from the lens that we look at Syria a solution except a political one. So I plead to everybody that can help, all the capitals in the world, to figure out a way that they could assist the Syrian people to bring a ceasefire, a durable ceasefire. And in that, then you'll have opportunity to, if not even rebuild, try to stabilize what is left of Syria. To the core question of how you deal with it, we have tried, and I can tell you I've lost 15 staff members to active distributions trying to reach the most vulnerable, and you then add another 200 plus of my colleagues that have worked in hospitals where they received direct hits, where that infrastructure was reconstructed, rehabbed 2 or 3 times. There is no answer. I am actually lost for words. The moral compass is not there. Dignity does not exist. And I don't see a military solution to Syria. And I'm not saying this because I wear my humanitarian hat. As a human being who's been inside Syria and watched what the people had to endure and have to be displaced inside Syria 5 to 7 times within about a 30-mile radius, added to it all the refugee creation. So the solution I see is the pressures to be put by all parties involved and member states to actually come to some kind of an agreement to bring durable peace, ceasefire, and a political solution to Syria. And once that happened, I think we will probably have a chance to at least participate into some form of resiliency or recovery. But apart from that, and I don't see that happening in the near future. I hope I'm wrong. I'm very much of an optimist. I've been doing this for about 10 years. And every week we say, we hope we see a difference, but unfortunately we're not there. But I'm optimistic, and I hope, as I've spoken in many forums about this issue, that it will resonate somewhere in the world. And I'm pretty sure there are a lot of good people that are working hard at it. It just hasn't had the breakthrough yet. But you're absolutely right, Jennifer. We don't have a solution to Syria on reconstruction, on stability, on saving lives, if we cannot bring a sustainable and a durable ceasefire.
Thank you, Husni. Kevin, this question is for you from Luz Rooney. Ambassador Kraft announced additional $108 million in humanitarian aid for Syria in early March. Can you give an update on the status of this assistance, and how is this aid allocated given the gravity of the situation in the country?
Thanks for the question. I don't know that exact donation where it's gone. I think a lot went to the World Food Program, supports their program. And I would note on that, it goes back to your earlier question about the cross-border. So to prepare for maybe a different future when it comes to our access from Turkey into Syria, we have been pre-positioning food and other items in the Northwest. And I can tell you, it's a matter of public record, WP has put 2 months of supply into the Northwest to give us a bit of a cushion in the event we don't see what we'd like to see. And I think you can assume that a large part of that was funded by the United States. The United States funds about 50% or more of the World Food Program in Syria. So it is a big donor there. Over.
Thank you, Kevin. The next question is for Husni from Giovanni. Do you believe that in the aftermath of COVID-19, that such negative effects on Syria will encourage Syrians to at least think about revolting against the government?
I'm not sure if I am the expert on the political side of that, but from a human perspective, I think COVID has brought new learnings to the two sides of Syria right now, being the regime area and the non-government area or non-regime. And I think what we are learning as we do actually have contacts into both areas, that people are very much pressured economically at the highest level. So it could very well be that it's not only COVID, is because of the situation of the economy and the status of the economy, which actually was on a free fall way before COVID, that has created probably a huge vulnerability. My colleague spoke earlier about the vulnerability moving from 7.1 million to 9.1 million in the government areas, and that's 2 million in less than 30 days. So you can also argue that when you have no job, when unemployment over 87%, 90% before COVID, the economy free fall, the devaluation of the currency, the banking challenges that are with the neighboring countries, most average people in Syria are at their limit. And that clearly we have seen few pockets of Syria demonstrating, for having opportunity for a change being supported. So I can tell you that it's just a matter of, another month or 2 or 3, if we continue at this pattern, that we will probably see more people exposed to the issue of economy and a COVID part. So I hope I've answered in my best abilities, understanding that, the whole idea that people went to the streets was in 2011 was to ask for reforms, and then it was to ask for freedom, and then we ended up in a world where we have now civil war in many parts of Syria at a rapid rate of destruction.
Thank you,
again,
Husni.
Giovanni.
Thank you. And this last question is for Kevin. Nearly 10 years of conflict. How best should the U.S. use the UN to end this conflict, knowing that the Security Council is at a stalemate?
No, that's a very good question. I think, of course, I'm not a U.S. diplomat, but I'm familiar with the diplomacy on a couple of different levels. First of all, again, this is a UNA-USA. I think the United States has strongly supported the UN Special Envoy for Syria, for peace in Syria, Mr. Geir Pedersen, a Norwegian diplomat, and a very able person, I should add. I think they have strongly supported his efforts to bring the parties together to achieve a solution. As you would imagine, it's been a long uphill struggle, but Geir continues to work at it. It's a challenging work that requires a special tenacity, I would say, to do that, because they're going into very difficult situations as well too. I think other different member states are doing obviously different things to what they think are best to try to create a new situation in Syria. Some member states, of course, are levying sanctions on Syria. Others are providing more support in different ways. It's all a bit of a mix. I mean, it's a very if you want to stand apart and not think of the human element, it's a very interesting geopolitical situation. Syria sits in a critical part of the world. You have many countries operating military forces inside Syria. There's occasional clashes, lots of frictions. And of course, it's the larger war between the government forces supported by the Russian Federation and the non-government forces. A non-government includes a number of groups which are registered terrorist groups or have been declared terrorist groups by the United Nations and other countries as well. So you have quite a mix there, and that's when you operate on the ground, as UN does, as the NGOs do, you have to try to deal with this. And one of our jobs, I think my task, is to try to move the humanitarian operation away from these considerations and these pressures as much as we possibly can. One cannot do it entirely, and we're not naive. Politics is a major factor here. But we try to keep in the humanitarian sphere and focus on our work of delivering assistance to Syrians wherever they may be. I would note, going back to your earlier question for the donors, the Western countries provide the money for the operations there almost entirely. But they put no restrictions on their money. So we spend their money, if you will, in areas controlled by the government and areas not controlled by the government too. So this is also at least a quasi-redeeming feature of the response thus far. Back to you, Catherine or Farah.
We actually have time to squeeze in one more question. So this question is for Sanjana. Can you share what is working in the response to the conflict?
Oh, that's $1 million question. Well, what is working? I think I've mentioned some of it already, particular to COVID and the reach that we've had. I think one of the things that I would say is that even though we have a $3.8 billion ask, we're doing pretty well as it compares to other crises. There's still a huge shortfall, but the fact that 10 years on, and having had the Brussels conference, that there is still a level of interest globally in Syria, and that the fact that we are gaining more and more access, while there are constraints, but it is not the #1 issue anymore that it used to be a couple of years ago. The fact that we've still managed to reach 6.7 million people in 1 month, I think is an achievement given the situation. The funding, as I said, it remains quite consistent, which is helpful. So I think these are some of the things that are working when it comes to humanitarian assistance. People have stayed and delivered, which is I think critical, even though people's, even aid workers' lives are sometimes in danger. We continue to be able to provide assistance. I would say that with the resolution coming around, hopefully we'll still have an opportunity to use all modalities, which is so far has helped. Yeah, so these are some of the things. I think obviously it's not a rosy picture, and nothing, and whatever we do is still not enough. But we have had we've had the consistent funding. We've been able to reach people in need. The people in need have also gone down over the years. If you look at from the beginning of the crisis to today, the nature of the crisis is also changing quite a bit in that in not all cases it's about conflict and hostilities. It is about looking at a little bit more resilience and coping mechanisms, giving people a life of dignity, as I talked about before. So I still remain hopeful that we can continue to provide the need, to provide to the needs. Over.
Thank you, Sanjana, and I'll turn it over to Catherine.
Thanks, Farah. I did have one question for the panelists that I think some in our audience would be interested to hear. Those who know that about the Caesar Act, which is a bipartisan act of Congress which levied additional sanctions on the Syrian government, as well as secondary sanctions, meaning that if you're a country or a business that does business with the Syrian government, you too can be sanctioned. These went into effect, I believe, on June 17th. I know it's still early, but is there any indication to suggest that these sanctions are having their intended effect?
Catherine, I think you put it, it's too hard to tell. We've done a lot of work on sanctions before, trying to figure out and identify what the impacts are. As you would know, the European Union, the United States, and others who have imposed sanctions have always claimed that they will give humanitarian exemptions, and that's proven to be the case. The problems that we've noticed are become almost with over-compliance or zealousness or concerns about by banks and institutions who don't want to do anything wrong. So you'll have many NGOs, particularly international NGOs, operating from a different country with Syria on their bank account number. It becomes a problem. Myself, renting my apartment in Jordan was delayed because my title has the word Syria in it, and the bank had all kinds of questions and phone calls, etc. And this is just a very small example, but I know that it's the funding flows from banks that provide to buy things and to pay salaries that has been impacted. Identifying, particularly with COVID-19 comes to mind. Has there been any specific problems in the COVID response that that sanctions of any kind, this is before Caesar, have stopped? And the bottom answer is no. And that's after a lot of consultation with WHO and others. But it's something we look at very closely, and we'll see. I think I could give a better answer to your question in 2 or 3 months. Back to you.
Thanks so much, Kevin. And this is a question for the group. We have an audience of UNA USA members who we're proud to say are deeply interested in these issues, deeply interested in helping. What can we do? What can we do to support your efforts to help in Syria?
Yeah. Well, I'll take a stab at that question, and it's a very good question too. And I'd say, and again, it's a generalization, and speak as an American citizen among other citizens. Interest in international affairs in the United States, in my personal view, is not near what it should be. I remember years ago, I sat on a panel, this goes back some years, with the operations officer of CNN. It was right after all the business about O.J. Simpson. And I said, why did you have all this O.J. Simpson coverage? It's too much. And he said, we tried to stop it, but people insisted we had more. And he said, about the population of US then was about 300 million, maybe a bit less. He said, we've identified only out of 5 million people really have a sustained interest in international affairs, which I find appalling. So one, you're very interested in what's going on outside the confines of the United States is important. I think secondly is speaking up and advocacy. It has an impact. I don't know how many people actually write to their senator or their representative and say, this is an issue about Syria I'm concerned about, or this is international I'm concerned about. I think you have to put these things up on the radar. It may be just a little bit, to the greater effort, but it's important to be seen. And I think the public statements, and even events like this, Catherine, that widen information, that widen understanding, that increase interest, I think this is important. And what can I say? Yeah, back to you.
I couldn't agree with more. I mean, just piggybacking Kevin. After 10 years, you could almost look at the news and the newspapers, and it could almost argue that we're almost a forgotten war or a stalemate war. So having forums like this, an audience that is interested, intrigued, and dedicated to take this message to the broader conversation in any advocacy forum, House of Representatives, senators, newspapers, media, to say, look, we still have a major mess on our side here called Syria, and it's not going away. And as an economist, I can say that the price tag will continue to grow. It is not the US problem, it's the world's problem. And the sooner that we continue the conversation and keep Syria's word and name up front, we probably have a better chance to have it resonate with some of the stakeholders around the world, either in the media or in the political arena. I know the UN is very much active in that role, but the UN is a product of support. But we need stakeholders and various civil movement in any part of the world, not limited to America, to tell their respective representative that I may not be interested directly in Syria, but there is something awfully going out there that we should continue to look at, support, and mitigate. Thank you again.
Sanjana, we'll give you the last word.
Well, I think they've really said it all. I mean, for me, yeah, I mean, just to keep Syria on the map. I mean, for us who work on Syria, it is, it's our daily lives. But I mean, when you do go outside of this world of the daily lives of serving Syrians, it's perhaps not that not that much talked about as much. So any efforts to amplify advocacy, to make the world continue to remember Syrians and the Syrian crisis is always helpful, small or big. I think that it's important that we continue to keep discussing, continue to look for solutions, continue to help, and of course, one of the main things that we can do about it is to ensure that people are still aware that this crisis, 10 years on, is probably as bad as it was when it started, and with, of course, different and more complex issues arising as well.
Catherine, if I could just jump in on that just a little bit too. And again, for the membership of UNA USA, you obviously have a deep interest in the United Nations. In my view, even beyond Syria, the basic work of the UN, particularly the humanitarian side of the UN that we are on, and with our partners like Descartes, is the restoration and maintenance of human dignity. Every person in the world deserves a chance to be healthy, to be educated, to have a future for their children. And this is the work that the UN and our partners are engaged in Syria and elsewhere. But I think that one can be proud, even though it's has many faults and there's things we could do better and so forth and so on. But you can be proud of the work that the UN and our partners do in Syria. As Husni indicated, this is often overlooked. Dozens of lives of humanitarian workers, UN and particularly NGOs, have been killed in this conflict. Medical professionals, nurses, doctors, truck drivers, you name it, probably now into the hundreds, 200, 300, 400 people. So we're at it, and we really appreciate your support and your interest. Back to you.
That's a great note to end on, Kevin. Thank you. I just want to say on behalf of UNA USA and those of us at the UN Foundation, we're so honored to have you, Kevin, and Sanjana and Husni here today. And we're also so moved by the work that you do. And just so grateful that you could spend some time with us today. And we are we want to support you in any way we can. So, come back to us, let us know how we can do it. And I will, I'm going to hand it over to my colleague Farah now.
Great, thanks, Catherine. Yes, and much like the speakers have mentioned, a big thanks to you all. Taking action is really important. As it's been mentioned, there's over 5.5 million who have fled Syria, 6.7 million are internally displaced, and currently with the 11.1 million people in need of humanitarian assistance. So to put this in other terms, the number of people needing humanitarian assistance is more than the population of the entire metro Los Angeles area. So if you think about every single resident of Los Angeles and its surrounding suburbs required some sort of shelter, food, healthcare, education, and other vital aid, that is appalling. And that is exactly why we're giving you an opportunity to advocate. We heard Kevin mention that advocacy is important, and we couldn't agree more. So right now we've made it easy for you to show your support of the UN's critical work in Syria. Text the word refugee to the number 738-674 to let your member of Congress know that you're advocating on behalf of Syrian refugees. And then quickly, of course, there's lots more ways that you can take action as a member of UNA USA. When you join UNA USA, you're joining 20,000 other Americans around the country who know the importance of the UN and understand that we need the UN to help make our world more just, healthy, and fulfilled. So learn more at unausa.org. And then finally, please join us for more upcoming GEOS events, like next week's discussion of multilateralism under fire, and then the following week, the impact of COVID-19 on the women's rights movement. So again, a sincere thank you to our esteemed speakers, Kevin Kennedy, Sanjana Quazi, and Husni Al-Barazi, our moderator, Catherine Cross, but most of all, thank you for joining us today. Wishing you all good health and happiness until next time.
Thank you. Bye.
Very, very much.
Bye.